It's my honor today to introduce you to the panelists. I wanted to share with you, we have a call to action panel for a couple of reasons. I'd like to give a shout out, since that's what we're saying, to Tim Murray in the room today. Some of you know him as the former executive director of the Pretrial Justice Institute, and also going back in time, although like Nick, I wasn't around back then either, as the father of the drug court movement. But I think Tim's legacy will actually be as the architect of a new coalition of partners to come together to work at issues at the local level. And so it is within his spirit that we put a call to action panel together for this initiative's launch today. Moderating today's panel is Bill Keller, the editor-in-chief of the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization, nonpartisan news organization focused on crime and punishment in the United States. And bios are all available in your folders. Also on the panel today, we have George Gascon, the district attorney for the city and county of San Francisco. We have Ed Monahan, public advocate for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Judge Eric Washington, Chief Justice in the District of Columbia, and Sheriff Lupe Valdez from Dallas, and Rodney Monroe, Chief of Police in Mecklenburg. It's very exciting for us to have this panel today. Work at the local level requires incredible collaboration and coordination and trust and relationship building across stakeholder groups. And so we're excited to hear from these folks today about why this initiative is important. Each of them come from jurisdictions that have taken the lead in evidence-based practices at the local level and are making incredible strides working to reduce the misuse and overuse of jails in their jurisdictions. So Bill, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I feel a little like I'm in one of those old jokes about where you have a priest, a rabbi, an imam, a Wiccan, a Buddha, and so I've got a judge, a sheriff, a chief of police, a defender, and a prosecutor here. And if the subject wasn't so somber, I would suggest we could do a Saturday Night Live routine of some kind. We're going to try to make this a conversation, not a series of speeches. I thought I would start just by asking each of you to frame the problem of jails from your particular professional vantage point. Briefly, from where you sit, what is the heart of the problem? And maybe to go along with that, to some extent, are the people, your colleagues, your counterparts in your line of work, part of the problem? And I think we'll try to do this on a first name basis, but we'll start with Your Honor.
That's my first name is Your Honor. Thanks, Bill. I think the question is very broad, and I know that we don't have a lot of time. Let me try to narrow it a bit from purposes of the judiciary. One, we become judges because we believe in equal access and equal justice for all. I mean, that is a tenet. It's a basic premise of the judicial system. And we learn early that people are presumed innocent until proven beyond a reasonable doubt that they're guilty. And that our justice system depends in large measure on all those precepts and tenets being followed in order for us to feel comfortable that we are, in fact, administering justice without respect to person, administering justice fair and equally across the board, no matter who is before us on whatever charges have been brought. And the over-incarceration early on in the process of people whose the only reason they're being held is because they are unable to make a financial bond, not only disrupts that perception of fairness, which we are, as members of the judiciary, duty-bound to promote, because the rule of law is a cornerstone of our democracy. So in addition to that, though, we also have to deal with the ancillary consequences of incarcerating individuals who otherwise, based on information and risk assessment, would return to court, would not commit other crimes if released, is the disruption to their families and the communities and the impacts in our in the other portions or parts of the court system, the family court, housing court. It's just enormous. So there's a lot of incentive on part of judicial officers to get this right and to move away from over-incarcerating people, especially people who live in poverty, because those are the ones for whom those consequences, collateral consequences, are so devastating. To the extent, again, with respect to your second part of your question, are we part of the problem? In some ways, yes, because especially in jurisdictions that use money, it's so simple. It's so easy to use what is available because it means that when you're processing large numbers of cases, if you don't have to look at look at the people who come before you individually, and you can just look at their crime that they are alleged to have committed and set a bond schedule and be done with it, then in many ways you can process cases more efficiently. And there's such a premium today on processing cases efficiently. Sometimes we lose sight of the dual role. We must be efficient and effective in processing cases. But we can't lose sight that these are all people who come before us and have lives and have families and have connections to the community. So we are part of the problem because it's easy and it protects, in large measure, judges. Because if they're using a schedule and something happens, if in those occasions where someone is released because they were able to post a bond and they recommit a crime or fail to show, it's sometimes easy for trial judges, especially trial judges who come from elected jurisdictions.
Easy and politically safer.
Easily and politically safer.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a candid answer. I appreciate it. Sheriff Valdez.
Well, first
I
of
am
all,
going to move to first names, but everybody gets one.
Sheriff, that's my first name.
Sheriff.
I lost my first name when I became sheriff. But as you can see, I'm a little different than the rest of them. And I'm probably the only one whose feet can't touch the floor. So I'm way a lot different than the majority. And the
But you
gentleman
look taller in your
about,
Stetson hat, though, I'll bet.
I'm sorry?
I bet you look taller in your Stetson hat.
I'm the only one who doesn't wear one in Texas. Actually, there's a huge picture called Sheriff Valdez and the Hats, because everybody else has a hat on and I don't. Anyway, the gentleman was saying that Miami's different. I think Texas is a little different too. One of the issues that I see is that there's a wrong perception that putting people in jail is going to stop crime. And I think Texas is great on that. But as I heard from the gentleman that Perry has even said, we need to make some changes there. But there's a misperception that putting people in jail is going to stop crime. And the other misperception is that they're not aware of how much it costs the taxpayers to keep people in jail. I think that information has never really gotten out. One of the things I constantly run into is they want somebody to pay for something. If something is done to me, somebody else has to pay for it. If somebody broke my car window, somebody needs to pay for that. And so we have this idea that making somebody pay for something is going to make things right. And I think what we have to change, even among law enforcement, is that that is not the case. Getting people started on a different route is going to stop crime, not putting people in jail. The other thing that I see in our field is that for the last 5 years, I have tried Dallas County. I'm over Dallas County. There's 31 cities in Dallas County. There's 2.4 million people, one of the biggest counties in the nation, and I have one of the biggest departments in the nation. And I'm what we call, I understand that some sheriffs in the East are jail administrators and others are, I'm what they call a full service sheriff. We do homicides, traffic, courts, and jail. And one of the problems that I see with our folks is I have tried for 5 years to get them to do cite and release for low amounts of grass, and they won't do it. They just feel that the public will be against them as perceiving them as being soft on crime. And we're elected officials. myself and the judges are all elected officials. If you get the slogan soft on crime put on you, then you almost have to do something to take that off. And one of the things law enforcement does is try to punish more. And I think this is an area where we have to look at that the concept of punishment is not solving the issue. We've already tried that, it didn't work. And so I think we need to go a different direction in changing the attitude or changing the environment or changing something about the individual. We have several programs, a prostitution diversion program, a training program, welding program, a software program, teaching inmates to go a different direction. And we're short term. I think the average stay for our folks is 60 days. So we're short term, and we have to be real mindful of how we get these programs so we can make some changes. And I think that the misperception of what we're actually doing needs to be changed so that we can go another direction.
Thank you. Chief Monroe, how does it look from the police chiefs?
Well, I think a lot of the issues are similar to what Sheriff Valdez has spoken about. But I think in law enforcement over the years, we've really tried to create a balance. At one time, 20, 30 years ago, it was about how many people can you arrest and get off the street and hence tell the citizens that your streets are safer. But that's not always the case. And I think as of late, law enforcement has tried to find that balance of enforcement as well as prevention for crimes. And I think that on the prevention side, that in a lot of cases we've made more progress on the prevention side than we have on the enforcement side. And we've become less reactive and a little more proactive in trying to identify problems in communities, problem people in communities, working with others, trying to divert people away from the criminal justice system, hopefully preventing them from committing crimes. You know, when I came to Charlotte 6 years ago, our jail population was hovering around 3,000, and we were about this close to authorizing the building of a new jail. And just inside of 4 years, we've been able to reduce that population by over 14%, from 3,000 down to about 1,700, whereby they've taken the building of a new jail off the table, but have rediverted that money somewhere else other than within the criminal justice system in order for us to do more things that allowed us to get to that point. So when you start talking about programs such as diversion, reentry, programs like that cost money. When you start talking about educational opportunities for some of our young people, that the graduation rate is below 70%, it takes money to focus on opportunities to allow kids to graduate, whereby hopefully they don't fall prey to criminal activity or the criminal justice system. So I believe that from law enforcement perspective that we get it, but a lot of times we don't necessarily get the full support on that prevention side as much as we do on the enforcement side. If I were to ask for 100 more officers, I stand a much better chance in getting funded for that 100 officers than I would for a fraction of that cost to support organizations and other opportunities for reentry and prevention programs. So that's kind of the quagmire that we're in.
Is your job elected or appointed?
Who, me?
Yeah.
Is my governor or?
Your job, your position.
No, I'm appointed.
You're appointed.
I'm appointed.
I mean, I wonder how much difference that makes, even in terms of what you can propose, that you don't have to face the voters with a tough on crime.
Well, I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. From my perspective, being appointed, it allows me to follow an edict that's a little more direct as it relates to just my function. I'm not looking to play to a particular constituency. It's about public safety. It's about quality of life in communities, and that's the soapbox that I'm able to speak from.
Counselor, your turn.
Bill, your question is, what's the problem and what part
Well, how does the
what-
problem look, particularly from your vantage point,
Yeah.
maybe from the vantage point of a defender? And along with that, are there some ways in which your colleagues, your cohort, is part of the problem?
So I see the problem as a lack of leadership, a lack of sustained leadership. Leaders really look into the distance. They find a way according to a common sense methodology. They work with allies that aren't just their friends. They form partnerships with people that they might be on opposite sides in the courtroom with. And public defenders are part of the problem of not exercising their role in the system to their leadership role to be part of the solution and seeing themselves as a co-equal partner in the problem and in achieving the solution. An analogy I think of, it's a crude analogy. Imagine the criminal justice system were a car manufacturer, and the car was being manufactured with stuff coming down the assembly line, and the people responsible didn't have enough resources up at the front end of the line. Or somebody who had an essential role wasn't even present on the assembly line putting their part into it. And the person that was supervising didn't make sure they were there. You know, and the car came down and it wasn't built very well because what was done at the front end was such poor quality, such lack of resources, without all the people relevant to their parts being there. It's a crude analogy. And to complicate it, what if the best parts weren't being used because people were uninterested in what the best science was? What if we were in an emergency room and the doctor didn't know the best practice and an essential person wasn't even in the room when the person was being operated on? You know, public defenders, our problem is we don't have resources. We're the lowest on the political totem pole. We have too many cases. We don't need anybody to come to us and explain that poverty and race is not a crime. We know that. That's why we're in this business. Our part of the problem is we have to better exercise our role to get our inadequate resources at the front end, or to get adequate resources at the front end, so we can do what only we can do, which is to bring the best knowledge and science to the decision-making process of the judge and to be an alternative voice to the prosecutor. So.
Okay, thank you. Mr. District Attorney?
Yeah, you know, I'm going to take a slightly different approach, but it's interesting, Eric, that you use the car making example, because actually I take that example to another step, and that is, you know, if you were to walk in an automobile dealership and you say you want to buy a car, and the salesperson told you that there was about a 60 to 70% likelihood that that car was not going to run well, how many of you would buy that car? I think probably very few of us would, right? And that generally results in car manufacturers going out of business when that occurs. But in the criminal justice system, we fail 60 to 70% of the time. And we keep pouring money over and over again, and we keep doing the same things over and over again, and somehow expecting a different result. I think someone that was a lot smarter than I said that was kind of the definition of insanity. You know, I think personally, and I agree with everything that has been said this morning, but I think that the biggest problem in the criminal justice system today is the lack of bold new ideas. Look, there's no question that about 50 to 80% of the people that are in our jails today are there for pretrial reasons, and they're there mostly because they can't afford to get out. I'm talking from a county that now we have the only jail in the state of California that is running at 50% empty, and our crime has continued to go down. So I know that you can reduce jail population, and we certainly need to do more. But here's the problem that I see. While it is important to deal with pretrial procedures, and there is no question that we should have diversion, and there is no question that diversion should include education and other opportunities, and I certainly believe that our public defenders should be better funded probably everywhere except San Francisco. His case ratio is lower than ours. San Francisco is an anomaly. He is an elected official, which is also an anomaly. But here's a problem that I see. What is really driving the numbers and the disparity in our system is not what we do pre-trial, but it's what we do even before we get there. It is the fact that we're arresting, generally, people of color for very low-level offenses at very high rates. You take drug policy, for instance, and I know that I believe Nick mentioned it earlier, or someone else did, about the fact that we know that drug use in this country is equal across the social and racial spectrum. But when you go to any jail in this country today, the people that you see there doing time for drug use or drug possession are generally people of color. And the problem with that is that the system is broken at a more basic level. You know, in California, we're fortunate enough this last year that we passed Proposition 47. And for those of you that are not familiar with Prop 47, it's the first time in probably the last 3.5 decades in California where we have turned the clock around, and basically we have said we no longer are going to classify possession of drugs for personal use as a felony. And we're already seeing the impact. LA County Jail, for the first time in over 30 years, is not having to release people early. And the people that are doing their time now, they're actually getting to do their entire time, which is important because some of those people actually are dangerous. And they were being released early because this thing was never able to keep up with the pace of the people who were being arrested. And obviously, now that we're about 3 months into Prop 47, a lot of them were being arrested for low-level drugs. Now, I have to tell you, interestingly enough, there were only 3 DAs. There are 58 counties in California. There were only 3 DAs, myself and 2 others, that supported Prop 47. And I was told by many of my peers, no, we don't do drug work. We kind of disagree, but you know, we're seeing it already in LA County.
Although there was a lot of conservative support for Prop 47.
Support for Prop 47 was across the board. We had the Open Societies Foundation in one hand giving us money. We had Newt Gingrich doing an op-ed piece in support. I personally, since I was campaigning for it aggressively, I remember going to the Orange County Registry with Lenore Anderson, who I think is here still. And quite frankly, never thinking that the Orange County Register, which is the largest Republican paper in the state of California, actually supporting Prop 47, and they did. And they did because it made sense. And it speaks to what Nick mentioned earlier about Rick Perry talking about reform in our prison system. We're seeing support across the political spectrum. But we need to build the courage to say we can continue to tinker around the edges and believe that we're going to get great results. Because we're not. We're going to reduce some, but we're still going to put a lot of people through the process that do not need to be put through the process. And I'm a strong believer that one day in jail is one day too many. Jails are infectious. And there is no recovery from being incarcerated. Even if you think you're recovered, there is lasting impact throughout your life, not only personally for the person that went there, but for the family and their community. So we need to stop criminalizing low-level offenses the way that we have. We need to start looking at drugs. We need to start looking at many of these other low-level offenses. They should never get to your jail, Sheriff. Rodney, your officer should never have to make that arrest. And by the way, I was a chief of police of San Francisco. I was the number 2 guy in LA. So I come from both worlds. I fully understand the pressures in law enforcement, and I understand the pressures that I get as an elected official today.
I can imagine some people listening to this and saying, easy for you to say you represent San Francisco, and I love San Francisco. I grew up in the Bay Area, so don't get me wrong, but it is anomalous in the support for things like decriminalization of drugs. A lot harder if you work in Dallas.
You know, it's a yes and no. I have to tell you that I was invited early last year. I was invited to go speak to a group in Austin about justice reform. And I was fully expecting to be unwelcome. And the contrary
They're just
was
polite down there.
no, I don't think so. The contrary was the case.
Austin is a little different.
But
Austin is called
Austin
"Keep the
is in
City
Texas.
Weird." You know, that's their slogan.
Yeah,
Keep
but-
the city weird.
But listen, there's no question San Francisco offers certain opportunities that other places do not. But I have to tell you that did not stop the hate mail for coming my direction. We have, for instance, we had an increase in homicides the first 4 weeks of this year. And immediately people were saying, well, this is because of Prop 47, which obviously makes no sense at all because Prop 47 doesn't have anything to do with people that commit murder. So even in places like San Francisco, I'm still subjected to those risks. And actually, a lot of people don't realize about the voting bloc in San Francisco. It's much more moderate than the noise that you hear. The people that actually go and punch their ticket, and they do it every time, it's a much more moderate to conservative in some cases that people would think.
Just so I understand, would you say that the main factor in the reduction of the jail population in San Francisco County has been decriminalization or not enforcing in the same way the low-level drug offenses?
Well, it's more than that. You know, we created neighborhood courts, for instance, which is a completely non-judicial process where we divert a lot of low-level offenses. They're community-based panels. It's a restorative justice model. If you go through it and you meet all the conditions of the process, the arrest record gets sealed. So we take a lot of misdemeanors right off the bat. Prop 47 certainly now is having an impact. But even before Prop 47, since I took over in 2011. By 2012, we were running at about 30% vacancy. After Prop 47, we're now 50% vacancy in our jail.
You know, I think George is on a good point that it's a lot of front-end hard work, but I think some of our greatest impacts as it relates to the reduction in jail populations across many cities and states is what has been done on the front end with law enforcement. There are a lot of people, a lot of chiefs out here today that recognize the prevention, the analytical, the data-driven process of managing crime within your communities. In North Carolina, we're one of only 2 states that still look at 16 and 17-year-olds as adults.
New York, my home state, is the other one.
You're the other state. And with that, recognizing the struggle that the legislature and others have had in changing that, we recognize in law enforcement that more must be done on the front end, such as even in our school system. A lot of times we have gone through a transition where a lot of behaviors in our schools have become criminalized, whereby you can take a disruptive child in a classroom and now make that a disorderly conduct, or make that a harassment, make it a criminal offense. We were arresting on average of 700 kids a school year for criminal offenses 7 years ago. Now we've recognized that, and we've recognized the disproportionality of how that affects minority students, and we don't do that anymore. We had that ability to stop doing that. We also had the ability of working with schools to say that out-of-school suspension is wrong. You put a 13, 14, 15-year-old, and sometimes you couple that with an 18-year-old out there during the middle of the day, bad things are going to happen. Why take a kid out of school and then turn them over into the community to fall prey to the ill? They've stopped doing that. So I think that the more that we can do before you even put the handcuffs on a person to put them into the system, I think we stand a much better chance. But I think what we have to remember also is That's not pretty. So when you start talking about where do we as a government place our money, it's very easy to increase a budget line for police. It's very easy to do that, especially if crime starts to creep up. But I think we've had success over the years. Crime has gone down. Our populations inside of our jails and our prisons have gone down. But I think it's based on a lot of, some of it is based on a lot of good work of people recognizing the importance of decriminalizing, diverting people out of the system. Because once you get in that system, you're caught. Even the services that you receive once you're in that system, a lot of times are less than if you can receive that service outside of that system.
And I'd like to add to that, that the public wants law enforcement to be their fast solution. If a child is disrupting the school, they want somebody to fix it. So get the police officer. If there's a domestic violence, they want somebody to fix it. Get the police officer. If there's a burglary going on, they want somebody to fix it. Get the police officer. So the police officer is the fast response, is the fast answers to a lot of their issues. When we as officers don't see that as the solution, we see that as just a quick stop, but we need to do something else.
So how do you prevent that first stop from being the last stop?
Well, as I sit here and I listen, and I think it's all wonderful, and I actually applaud the efforts. And certainly, our job doesn't begin until the person is brought into the system as judges in terms of addressing the needs of that individual, the needs of the community. But we are still arresting a lot of people. There's a lot of overcrowding in our jails of people who are very low risk individuals, low risk both from their in terms of their returning to court, and low risk in terms of their being rearrested for committing another crime. And so, to a large degree, while these efforts will hopefully reduce the number of people brought to the courts and thus put in the position of having to be or being considered for jailing, we still are addressing what happens when they get to court. And I think that there's still a lot of work to be done there. And luckily, I think a lot of judicial leadership and a lot of judicial effort is being put into what happens once they are brought in. And we've had a lot of success in the sentencing context, as all of you know. We dealt with the back end first. A lot of evidence-based sentencing reform has gone on throughout the country, and I think it's proven to be very successful. The information, the data that drives the decisions now on whether someone should be incarcerated for actually after having committed a crime, and whether that will inure to the benefit of the community is significantly more advanced and well developed than it has been in the past, and jurisdictions around the country are using it. And so, to a large degree, we heard earlier, prison population is decreasing, and I think that is because there's alternatives. We talk here about pretrial, front-end diversion, critical. We have quite a bit of it here in the District of Columbia. And when I'm speaking, I'm really trying to speak more from a national perspective. We have a lot of programs here in the District of Columbia, but I want to take us outside of this environment and take us to jurisdictions around the country that don't perhaps have all the resources or don't have a unified judicial system. And so they have counties that are funding a lot of these efforts. And so what we've learned in this process over the last few years is that there is data, there is information, there is a science that tells us, and the District of Columbia has been doing this since robustly since the late 80s, 90s. And we've got a great deal of data that supports this, but even outside of our data, there's data throughout the country now, data generated by the work done by many of the foundations and Vera and others that show us that there are decisions that you can make on the front end with people who are low risk that saves money because we're not taking them out, we're not housing them or warehousing them in jails pending trial, that have all of the beneficial outcomes because they're not more likely later on to commit another crime or a crime. They're more likely to to have positive outcomes as opposed to negative outcomes. And so I think that one of the things we've learned as a judiciary is that we have a voice that is powerful in this conversation. Polling shows judges are amongst the most trusted. I think the polling shows we're the most trusted, but I'm not here to brag. Of the participants in the criminal justice system, so to the extent that judicial leadership on this issue, as it was in sentencing, is brought to bear, I think the public will come to accept that that we're not making decisions on whether to release people in a way that's not consistent with what they already believe. And interestingly, polling shows that most Americans, an overwhelming percentage of Americans, believe, for example, talking about pretrial release, that judges are sitting there making risk assessments. They think that's what we do. In fact, they are surprised, shocked, in fact, when they hear, oh no, we look at a money schedule and release people based on what their crime was and don't look at them as individuals or try to assess their risk. Education. One of the great things about the safety challenge is that it's an opportunity for us to educate the public. And educating the public will assist judicial officers who want to do the right thing, who want to make decisions based on the issues that they are confronted with, which is safety to the community and the opportunity for that person to return, or likelihood of that person returning, to face the charges that they are actually arrested for. So we have a lot of data now that needs to be coalesced in different jurisdictions. Kentucky is one because they've released people for long, without money, and we have efforts being done around the country, led by judicial officers, which is seeing great results. And I'm so pleased. And I just want to say this because I talked about earlier the problems and how we are the problem. We are significantly part of the solution. And it was mentioned earlier about the efforts in New Jersey, Chief Justice Rabner's efforts there to reform that pretrial justice system, and the legislative partnerships and the coalition that put together that made the changes that is going to allow them to make evidence-based risk assessments and make decisions about who should be released is going to transform New Jersey and reduce their jail population, save money, allow it to be used for diversion. Mental health, huge issue that needs to be addressed. Other restorative justice concepts need to be brought in at the front end. The money can be diverted for that purpose if we do it correctly. In Arizona, Chief Justice Bales. In Indiana, former Chief Justice Brent Dixon have led groups that have worked with the National Center for State Courts and Public Welfare Foundation, Arnold, and others to start to put together programs, and they are getting great results. A story told by Chief Justice Dixon, former Chief Justice Dixon from Indiana, is he came and brought forth one of the legislators who was very much supportive of bail and the bond industry, turned around to come back and say, look, I'm now for reform. I understand information, data, the type of communications that the MacArthur Foundation is talking about using in these jurisdictions to educate the public, to better inform the judicial officers. As I said, we are part of the problem. We need to have bolstering. We need to understand this works. All that's great. And so I think all the programs that we're talking about here are fabulous. And I think they, surely in every jurisdiction, you have to look and see what works best in your jurisdiction. But luckily, the judicial officers are taking the lead also.
I want to throw out a thought that occurs to me that maybe is an uncomfortable thought, and see if the panel wants to respond to it. When you listen to the sort of general political conversation about reducing mass incarceration, there's a sort of suggestion that one of the reasons to do it is we waste a lot of money. It's not just that we're wasting human potential, we're wasting money. And the implication is that if we fix it, we can save money. And yet every one of you is identifying a need for more resources. And it seems to me everything from reducing the burden on defenders, the immense caseloads, setting up alternatives to the regular courts, drug courts, mental health courts, veterans courts, and then providing mental health services to the people who need it, which we don't do very well in jails and don't do hardly at all outside of jails. Rodney talked about the need to intervene in schools and improve the level of engagement of young people, 16, 17, 18-year-olds, while they're still in school. All of these things, and a lot of other things, cost money. If we fix the system, is it going to be, should we just reconcile ourselves to the fact that it's going to cost more?
Actually, yeah, I don't think it's going to cost more. Okay, but here's the problem. We need to put the solutions where they belong. If you want to create, for instance, in my county, we're talking about building a new jail, even though our jail is 50% empty. And one of the arguments that is being made is that we should have better mental health services in the jail. Well, I would argue that the people that provide better mental health services are health professionals and not people in the jail. I would also argue that the best people to provide for educations are educators and not police officers, and certainly not prosecutors or public defenders or judges. So the question becomes one of, how do we redefine the role of the criminal justice system? Look, there's always going to be killers. There's always going to be people that are going to assault people with weapons, the violence, and those people are the people that we do very well with. We know how to deal with those people very effectively. We're not equipped, nor will we ever be equipped, to handle mental health in our jails, or through policing, or prosecution, nor are we going to do well with people that are suffering from substance abuse, which most medical professionals would tell you that jails are not going to help them. And quite frankly, we don't do very well with youthful offenders because we don't even understand how their brain functions, right? So I would argue
that ripple of laughter was all the parents of teenagers.
No, well, including myself, right? But I would argue that we pay in California around $62,000 to incarcerate someone per year. You can put people through tremendous level of services for significantly less money.
You can put them through Stanford for less money.
Well, absolutely you could, but let's assume that, the people that we're talking about would not qualify to go to Stanford, right? But they certainly qualify to have decent housing, and they certainly qualify to be provided with services in order to be able to get out of a bad situation. And that costs a fraction of $62,000, never mind the cost of the entire system that supports getting someone to the place where then they cost $62,000.
There is enormous waste in the criminal justice incarceration of people in jail. And it's not only raw waste, it's a stupid investment. The data is clear on this. We are investing in putting people in jails for a day or two or 7. And we know if they're low or moderate risk, our investment is going to have a return of future criminal activity. That is ignorant. Now, if we were in charge of making the cars that were so poorly made and was bankrupting us, we wouldn't use cheap parts at the front end. We wouldn't fail to have an investment at the front end. At the same time that we're wasting an enormous amount of money on incarcerating people with counterproductive effects, we are under-resourcing the entire criminal justice system, and we're not putting anywhere near adequate resources into the public defender side. And if we were the CEO of an organization and we had a problem, we'd look around the organization and say, who's got the most energy to solve this problem? And we'd invest in those people to help us solve the problem. The people in the criminal justice system that have the professional responsibility to represent the interest of the client, who could generate the alternative sentencing programs, who could be at first appearance to say, no, here's what the best data and science tell us. Don't do this, judge, for this low-risk guy. It's going to actually have the reverse Here's an alternative to what you want to do that actually looks at the underlying problems as opposed to jail. We are putting the least resources in that entity in the criminal justice system. And if we would make a modest investment, if the factory line is coming down so fast that all of us can't do our part responsibly, guess what? We have a car that isn't reliable, and we have failure at an enormous rate. If we could pay attention to people as individuals and work with them and apply the best data and science to the solution for the individual, if we all had enough time to do that, and there were programs available, and we weren't wasting our money, there would be a dramatic difference.
You know, I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all right. Go ahead.
You go ahead. Sheriff.
We're gonna fight over it.
There you go.
You were talking about the financial end. One of the things we did was we actually showed the taxpayers the cost savings in putting out programs instead of incarcerating folks. And we did a really good sample of this is how much you will save. And we found that we could put a person into a program as many as 4 or 5 times before it would cost what it costs to incarcerate them. So therefore, I used the theme, you know, this person can fail 3 times before it actually costs to keep them in jail. The other thing we did was we did a study of some of the folks who were actually using the services. And we found, I can't remember what the exact number, but it was something like 15% of the people were using 65% of the services. It meant that we're using the hospital, the ambulance, the jail, the doctors, and all of that. They were using all this amount when they could actually be saving money by doing something with that 15%. The other thing that I found that really was impressive to us, that if we provided programs that would keep the person busy, that would keep the person learning, would give the person self-worth, and would put worth back into the community. In other words, they were doing something to help the community, actually help them grow. So it was finding something that would be of interest to them that would provide these 4 things that would help from keeping them from coming back.
You know, another issue that if you look at, everything that has to do with the criminal justice system is government driven. A lot of the efforts to reform the criminal justice system and the resources needed to reform the criminal justice system is outside of government. A classic example, we have a call-in program. We bring in 15 individuals that are on probation that, through our studies, show that there is a high propensity for them to re-engage in criminal activity. We focus on them. I could bring in all of my law enforcement partners, the FBI, DEA, ATF, Marshal Service, and say to them that the resources that I have, which in some cases are unlimited, to go after you should you continue to involve yourself in criminal activity is enormous. You can't dodge that. And then an hour later, I bring in service providers that are working on a shoestring budget to say to them, I could help you to not reoffend by providing you with substance abuse training, providing you with job skills training, other mentoring and tutoring skills that would allow you to be successful. But yet they're sitting there struggling. They could have just as greater impact on these individuals as law enforcement, but yet they don't have the resources in order to bring about a much greater and long-lasting change in that individual than I, on law enforcement, through the government, would continue to fund. I was asked the question, well, Chief, if someone came up to you and say, well, let's take $15 million of your budget to, and you can identify the organizations and so forth that you believe that can help provide these additional services, would I be willing to do that? I scratched my head for a long time and trying to, but yes, at the end of the day, yes. If I could help lead and help direct some of those resources, my response would be yes.
I've got to apologize to the audience because we've run out of time, and the guy with the cane is going to come and pull us off the stage, and I haven't dipped into any of your questions, so they were all incredibly thoughtful, brilliant. So hang on to them for next time around. It's a great panel. You guys could have gone on for another hour. I would have listened. I know you're used to having the last word, so if you...
No, I want to say just, and I talked about the challenge and the data and how important that is for all of us to have this data. But to a large degree, and I know I'm speaking, as I said, I'm trying to speak more broadly than just the District of Columbia. We have an outstanding pretrial services agency, but I don't want the people to leave with the misconception that everyone you release using evidence-based risk assessment is going to need supervision in the community. There are a lot of people in jails right now who don't need any of that. So in terms of cost savings, there should be tremendous savings because there could be, these are individuals who could be released from jail today, would not cost you any additional money to supervise, and yet we're spending, as you suggested, $60,000 or more a year to house them. So there could be tremendous cost savings.
Again, thank you. If I have to get arrested, I want it to be in one of your jurisdictions.
Thank you.
Hopefully we don't get arrested.